I feel really quite humbled to be here today, and I'd like to acknowledge the skills of my colleagues who are part of the discussion today, and say thank you so much for your insight and your wonderful knowledge that you've shared with us all around working with men who have violence in their life. Again, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the country of the Darug people, and I'd like to again pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm going to do my presentation in three parts, and the first part is going to be my personal story. The second part is going to be about how I come to work in the field of working with Aboriginal men who have violence in their life and who are violent in their life. And then I'm going to talk for the last 10 minutes about the programs that I'm involved with, and with my colleague Eric Hudson. And I must say I'm really privileged to work with Eric. He's my mentor. He's my friend, and I'm very proud to say he's a man who I love very much. And you know, 13 and a half years ago, I would not have said that aloud about any other man. And the journey of my life has enabled me to be able to say that, and I have absolute respect for Eric because he's taught me so much and continues to teach me so much. I'm going to tell you some things that are going to be a little bit difficult and challenging for you to hear, possibly. There's stories about my life, and I invite you to take pause if you are affected by what I tell you, to take pause, take some self-care, and you may want to just excuse yourself and take a time out. And I will be expressing my own personal journey. And I've done a lot of work around what happened to me, so as I'm able to now talk about it in quite a nonchalant way. So, yeah, but I invite you to just please be aware and take care of yourself as I tell my story. Okay. I'm the second youngest son of 4 boys and 3 girls. My father is a Barkindji man and my mother is Manyangapa. And my father and mother followed the traditional marriage lines of the Barkindji moiety, and are married accordingly. So I take on my father's clan because of my grandmother, his mother, and the Barker is the Darling River, the river that you know as the Darling River, the second longest river in Australia. It's called the Barker in our language, and the Kinji are the people of the river. So I'm Barkindji, and that is our title. We are the traditional custodians of the river, just south of Burke, right down to the junction of the Murray River at Wentworth. My father was a shearer and a fencer and a general labourer. My mother was a stay-at-home mum. Not that we really had a home to stay at home in. We had huts, we had cars that we lived in council tents, and we lived in missions and reserves. My father died in 1974, and as a result, I was taken from my mother in 1975, and she was struggling with alcohol abuse as a result of the loss of my father. My father was an extremely violent man. He was very violent. I have memories of when I was young and in the hospital once for an accident that I had where I got burnt, and my family came in to visit me, but they also came in to visit my mum because she was in hospital as well as a result of my father's violence. There was a lot of violence within our community because alcohol became more prevalent and available to Aboriginal people, and I remember quite vividly the decline of our communities as a result of the use of alcohol. But there was also at that time a separation where the people who were drinking alcohol were not allowed into the main community. They did it on the fringes of the community, and they came into the community, they went to bed, they were kept quiet, and they were very respectful of the fact that there were children and women in those communities who did not appreciate the use of alcohol. In 1975, I and my 2 brothers, one younger by 5 years and one older by 2 years, we were removed from my mum and placed into the care of the state. The state enacted an act which enabled them to be able to put us as far away from our mother as was physically possible, but to remain within the state. So we were taken from a little town called Lake Jellicoe, which is about 5.5, 6 hours west of here, and we were put into a boys' home called Sunnylands Boys' Home, and that's up near Lismore. We remained in the boys' home. I stayed there for 5 years, and All the time that I was there, I had no further contact with my mother. My mother died in 1976, and they told us 2 weeks after she died that she had passed away and that she was buried. We were invited into the office of the boys' home, and the parents of the home informed us that our mother had died. Myself and my little brother and my older brother all stood there holding each other crying. And then we were told to go outside and play. We didn't know what the cause was of death. We didn't know where she was buried, and we had no idea of what we were going to do. For me, at that time in my life, I remember having absolute fear just consume me. I had nothing left in the world other than my brothers, and I kept saying to myself, who's going to look after us? The boys' home was run by an organisation called the United Protestants Association, and that association, what it did was it ran the boys' home during the school terms, but in the school holidays, the children and the boys, it was just boys then, the boys were able to return in the school holiday to either their home or to be fostered out for the school holidays with families that registered to be foster carers. And so what happened with me is they separated up the three boys, and we would regularly go and stay with a particular family. And I stayed with a family in Ballina, and they had there was 4 girls in that family and 2 boys. I was 10 years old when I started going there, and it was a nice family. They were quite religious. We went to church regularly, and I had my first experience of being sexually abused, and I didn't realise this until later on in my life, that I had been sexually molested by girls that were older than me. And the girls in that family took advantage of me, and they abused me sexually. That family, the mother became ill. There was no father in that family. I don't know what happened to the father. There was never a father there. The mother became ill, and they were unable to take care of me anymore, and I moved then to a family in Byron Bay, and their name are the Kerrigans, a wonderful Irish descent family, beautiful people. Well, the father's Irish, dad's Irish, and mum's of Dutch descent, Hollandkvist, and that's her last name, prior to marriage. And I moved with them, and I stayed there quite regularly throughout the school holidays. Had a wonderful relationship, but my foster dad, he drank a lot, and he was prone to bouts of aggression and anger. He was never physically violent, but he was threatening and intimidating, and I started having more and more anxiety as I lived there. I developed a great fear of this man, and never felt that I had any capacity to stand up to him and to speak my mind and express what I thought or felt. They had been trying for a long time to foster me out on a full-time basis, and they were unsuccessful because they weren't a very religious family. They did attend church, but they weren't religious by way of, I don't know, they weren't happy clappers, they weren't knocking on doors, and they weren't, selling the good Lord, the good word to the Lord to everybody and all and sundry in the neighbourhood. But they were good, honest Christian people who worked hard, and they endeavoured to provide a good home and a good environment for their family. They had one son who is 5 months younger than I am, and they endeavoured to get me into their full-time care, but without fail. In the meantime, a man by the name of Heinz Putin, and I'm of no fear at all mention this name, and I don't care about any legal rebuke. This man is a pedophile. He lives in the Philippines, and you'll see how this all falls into place shortly. He was a lay preacher with the Baptist Church, and he was friends with the woman who ran the boys' home, and he had made application for a child to be placed in his care. I was a good-looking kid. I kid you not, I was a handsome kid. I had the smile that, I had a Colgate smile, and I had this full head of hair, and I had I love life. With all the pain and suffering, I was a happy kid that tried to do my best. I was 14 years old when I went into the care of Heinz Putin, and within 24 hours of being in his care, he had molested me. Within 48 hours of being in his care, he had raped me. And then after he raped me, he proceeded to put electrodes on me and tried to stimulate my genitals and my other parts of my body. And he did this on a regular basis for around about 3 months. I had endeavoured to try to get in contact with my brother to get help, but my brother had been taken, my older brother had been removed from the boys' home, placed in the care of another family where he was basically a farmhand, and he was not able to assist or support me. I started to shut down. Heinz Putin also gave me alcohol as a means to get me to relax. So it was not uncommon for me to drink really potent homemade alcohol that the guy next door made. He had a distillery. He had a still that he made. It was basically just rocket fuel that he made, and Heinz would give me that, and then he would molest me, and then he would give it to me to calm me down. And the impact of that was immense. I withdrew. I withdrew from everything and everybody and everything. I become quite shut down. I loved art. I was an A student in art, and everything I did, I just loved art. And I would invest everything that I had when I did it in art. I stopped painting, I stopped drawing, I stopped doing art after I got molested. I stopped communicating. I did a whole lot of things that were very peculiar, I guess is the best way to put it, considering what kind of a person I was prior to the molestations. I was fortunate that the carer for the boys' home, the social worker who was in charge of managing the boys, he came and visited me, and he asked me if everything was okay, and I couldn't answer him. I couldn't say yes, no, everything's not okay, I'm in trouble, I need help. I shut down, I went silent, and he read that as something is wrong. And he asked me what I wanted, and the only thing I could say to him is, I want to go home. I didn't know where home was, but I wanted to go there. He worked very quickly to get me out of there, and within 2 weeks' time, I was in the care of the Kerrigan's family, but the damage was done. I had now started, I used alcohol. I knew the effects of alcohol. I knew what it did. I knew how it could help me to stop feeling the feelings that I felt. So when I moved into the Kerrigans, I was going to high school at Mullumbimby High. And I don't know if any of you know about Mullumbimby High. It's just up the road from Nimbin. Nimbin's got a great reputation in regards to its capacity to grow some of the best marijuana in the world. We used to access that. I used to access that. And I started using in high school in year 9. I started using on a daily basis alcohol and marijuana to deal with the feelings that kept coming up for me. And I also felt a lot of responsibility that I had let myself down. I should have done this. I should have done that. How could I have let that happen? In hindsight, I would think back I should have said no. I should have stood up to the woman at the boys' home and said no, I didn't want to go there. I should have done a whole lot of things. I had a lot of resentment, a lot of anger at myself. And I don't want to use this as a justification. I'm telling you what is factual, what I know that I felt and what went on for me. So I went into the care of the Kerrigans, and I struggled. I couldn't sleep at night. I started smoking cigarettes. I was regularly using pot. There was always alcohol in the house, so I was regularly sneaking the alcohol to suppress the feelings that were coming up for me. And I was angry. I had rage happening in me, and it consumed me. And I played rugby league, and I was damn good at it. I played it at the first grade level, not at the same level as what they play now in Sydney, but I played for our community, the Byron Bay community, in the Red Devils. And when I went out on the football field, I would hit the biggest guys that I could find. I would throw every ounce of my being into tackling them and to hurting them, and I would start fights. I did karate and I boxed, and I became capable of handling myself. And what I did was I used those skills and I used that anger to try to find a place to belong within my community. I got kicked out of home at 17. My brother Graham, my natural brother Graham, was also living in Byron Bay. He and I moved into an apartment together, and we tried to live a normal functioning life. But it was all the time, it was drugs and alcohol and quite often violence. And if it wasn't violence towards other people, it was violence towards each other. Excuse me. So I decided to come back, try to connect with my Aboriginal family at the age of 18. I came down here to Sydney. I had a sister, my older sister Karen, who was a nurse here. I came down here to spend some time with her, and I went from here, I reconnected with her, stayed a few weeks, and I went out to West Wyalong and I reconnected with my two sisters out there. And I went and visited the grave where my mother and my grandfather were buried. And it was the first time that I'd seen that, their graveyard, their gravestones, and their graves. And it was the first time also that I'd seen my two sisters in 9 years. And I tried to fit into the community out there. I tried to fit into the Aboriginal community. I tried to fit into the non-Aboriginal community. And I was rejected by both communities. I was called a coconut, which is black on the outside and white on the inside. And I tried to fit in. I tried everything that I could. And I formed a relationship out there. It was the first long-term relationship that I had with a non-Aboriginal girl who was some years older than I am, and I was violent to her. I was physically, mentally and emotionally abusive to her. And I hated it. I didn't like what I was doing. I did it, and I didn't have any other skills to do anything any other way than to do what I was doing. And I was ashamed of it. And after it would happen, I would often say to her, "I'm so sorry, I will never do it again. I won't do it, I promise, I promise." And I stopped drinking. I went and spoke to the Salvation Army. I may as well go on and used heroin because it didn't help. It made no difference. I went and tried to get counselling support. I went and spoke to, I spoke to counsellors through the Salvation Army, and their suggestions were, well, if you stop drinking, then you might not be reacting the way that you're reacting and treating your partner the way that you're treating your partner. So I tried that, and it didn't work. I couldn't sleep at night. I couldn't function. I would be doing my day job. I worked at a bar in West Wyalong, and I'd be working, and I would have these thoughts just come into my mind about Heinz Putin. I would be triggered by smells. So many things that would happen that I'd just be consumed with it, and I wouldn't know what to do. And the easiest way to resolve it was to drink, to numb it. My partner and I, we moved to Albury to reconnect with more of my Aboriginal family, but also for work. And it was bad. I got to the point where I became really more physically violent than what I had been previously. And I didn't like it. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what was happening for me. And I didn't like the result of it. And I didn't like the fact that I was somebody who was domestically violent. I would see other men being violent towards their partners, either physically or emotionally and mentally. And I used to think to myself, how dare he do that to that woman? And I would often stand up for that woman, and I would often challenge the man to say, hey, you need to pull that up. But here I was doing the same thing. And I was stealth at it. I did it meticulously. I did it behind closed doors. And everyone used to go, oh, Ivan's a great guy. But they didn't know what Ivan was up to when Ivan was doing the things that he was doing at home. And we've heard that, Eric made mention of that today, about how, in the North Shore we think it's wonderful and it'll be great because they've got money and they've got the things that they need to make their life easier. But it happens there, and that's what was happening for me. It was happening for me because I had not resolved my own personal issues. I had a perception of what it was like to be a man, and that perception of what it was like to be a man was really, really narrow and really, really thin. And I had no guidance and support to be able to move outside of that. I finally I got a job with Telstra as a linesman. I worked my way up to become get an apprentice as a technician. I did my training in Brisbane. I'd lost the relationship that I had down in Albury, in West Wyalong, then in Albury, and then went from there. I moved up to Brisbane to do my apprentice as a technician. And when I was up there, I don't remember much about my apprenticeship. It was 18 months in Brisbane and I was drunk and stoned for the majority of it. I got an award at the presentations for the receiving of our certificates to say that we're qualified technicians theoretically. I received an award. I don't even know what I did to get that award. I kid you not, I was drunk and stoned for the majority of that time that I was up there. I have vague memories of being involved with the classes and stuff that I learned. And I remember a lot of violence as well. I remember violence in my everyday life. And violence in the streets. If we went out, it was all that macho bullshit, and I apologise for swearing, that macho stuff that guys carry on with. I was immersed in that because I believed that to be a man, I had to do that stuff. I thought that this is the thing that defines me as a man. I finished my apprenticeship. I moved back down to Albury. I travelled to and from Sydney regularly to do training, further training, and I met and fell in love with a beautiful woman who fell pregnant to me and gave me a little girl. And my little girl was born in Albury. And I tried with every ounce of my being to not be angry, to not be aggressive, to not be a bad father. I wanted to be all these things that I thought I should be, but I didn't know how to do it, and I had no help to do it. And I was too proud to go and say to somebody, I don't know how to do this, can you help me? I had a preconceived idea in my mind about what it was to be a father and how that should be, and then I tried to, in my very clumsy way, to be that father. And I was too proud to admit to my partner that I didn't know what I was doing, or that I was afraid, or that I was scared. I was too ashamed to say I don't know how to do something, because I thought I would be a failure if I did that. We stayed together for just on 7 years, and she finally had had enough of me, and the abuse was not so much physical, it was the emotional and mental type, the hardest type of abuse, or the most challenging abuse for the women to be able to explain the impacts of. I was mentally and emotionally abusing her, and I never saw it as that. I saw it as, all I'm doing is this, all I'm doing is that. But that's what I was doing. I was emotionally and mentally abusing her. And also my daughter, my beautiful little girl. And I left her and I went away with resentment. She left me. I had resentment. Everything seethed and I was angry. And in 2000, I'd moved from town to town, and I ended up back up in Ballina, and I had nothing, absolutely nothing. So I was going to take my own life, and I'd made arrangements. I'd got some rope. I'd found a place to hang myself. I wrote a nice little letter to my daughter saying I'm sorry, and I said about finding a time, a place, and a time. I found the place where I had the time, and it was 11 o'clock this Saturday night that I was going to hang myself, and there was an intervention. And I ended up, as a result of that, in a rehab called We Help Ourselves here in Sydney. And it was the first time I was ever confronted by other men about my behaviour. I was 35 years old. And I was in a rehab where other men were saying to me, that behaviour is not acceptable, you can't do that. And my response to that was automatically anger. How dare you tell me what I can and can't do? Who are you to tell me what I can and can't do? Blah, 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 blah. And I couldn't separate the fact that my feelings were my feelings and that somebody else didn't make me feel something. I argued till I was blue in the face that they made me feel like this because they said this, or she said that. And I had no idea that I was responsible for my feelings. Everything was out there. The blame was always out there. The blame was always projected out to my partner or to the police or to the barman or the bus driver or the taxi driver. Everything was projected out. When I sat in that rehab and I had to look inside, what I effectively did was I'd opened up a whole new door into the journey that is Ivan. And I had a realisation that, holy shit, I can actually change this. I do not have to keep going through this pain. I do not have to keep going through this. There were a whole lot of things that happened in that rehab, and one of them was that I was also assisted in dealing with my drug and alcohol problem by way of attending AA and NA meetings. And I went and did that, and I had to sit and listen and be quiet and do a whole lot of things that they suggest to do Nobody said to me, you have to do this. But for my own well-being, I knew I had to do it. If they said to me, you have to do this, I would have said, punch it, I'm not doing it, because you're telling me to do it. But I'd had enough of doing the same old thing and getting the same result, and those results weren't favourable to my spiritual, mental, emotional and my physical well-being. So I sat and I listened, and I talked about my alcohol abuse, I talked about my experience of being molested as a child, I talked about all the bad things that happened to me, and every time I talked about it, I felt like I was actually taking a layer of weight off myself. I started to actually believe that I was a nice person, that I was worthwhile, that I actually was a good man. I believed somewhere in the recesses, the darkest recesses of my mind, that I was a good man. But I never could quantify it to a level to say, yeah, I can actually stand here in the presence of a man like Eric Hudson and say, where Eric would say to me, you're a beautiful man, and I'd dismiss it. I can actually take that now because I've done the work to find the good man and to believe the good man. I did the rehab, I did 12 months of it, and then I set out from 2000 to this point, and I've never applied for a job in all that time. Everything that I've done has been offered to me. I stopped drinking and drugging, I went through rehab, I studied drama, I went and performed on stage and did a whole lot of other things which I loved doing. It was my opportunity to stand up in front of people and to be myself and to muck around and have fun. I did that, and then throughout the course of my life I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was thinking from 2000 on, I was thinking, what do I want to do? I had ideas about maybe going back and studying something in the engineering field, or maybe going back and studying something along where I could be physically active in my work. Instead, I got a phone call from the rehab where I went to, and they invited me to come back and be one of their staff because they wanted to increase the number of Aboriginal men who were coming into the service. And so I took it up and I became a residential support worker. Then when I was there, I was given the opportunity to study and get my Cert 4 in alcohol and other drug counselling. And the more I worked with men, not just Aboriginal men, but all men, I started to realise more and more about myself. I started to understand that my journey was not dissimilar to a lot of men's journey, that there was these preconceived ideas about what we should be that's placed on us by society as to what we should be doing and how we should be behaving and how we should be presenting to the world. And those views are quite distorted. I come to realise that those views are very, as Eric expressed, they're patriarchal. You're a man, you're supposed to play football, you're supposed to drink beer. The woman has her place, it's in the house. There was no equality for me around that sort of stuff. But when it was revealed to me about equality and what a beautiful thing it is to have a partnership where it's shared and it's equal and there's no power imbalance, then everything is really quite nice and smooth and it's really quite lovely and it's a beautiful place to be. As I work with the men in the rehab, I come to realise that a lot of those men grew up with fathers whose fathers went to war or were the result of the war, you know. And there was a whole lot of trauma that they'd inherited, whether it be the physical inheritance of it or whether it be as a result of their behaviours. Their behaviours were learned behaviours from the environments that they grew up in. I went on to work with Link-Up New South Wales, which reconnects the stolen generation families or people back to their families and their identities. I specialised in working with the AOD clients, and I found it really interesting that with the Aboriginal men, and especially the men from Kinchela, and I don't know if you don't know what Kinchela, I'll give you a brief of Kinchela. It was a state-run facility that was up near Port Macquarie, and some of the stories of the men that come through there is just horrendous. It was a farm environment. There were young Aboriginal men that were placed into Kinchela, and they spent 10 of 12, 15 years in there, and then they were kicked out into society. They had no skills, they had no family environment where they grew up in to be nurtured, loved, supported, helped and assisted in regards to understanding what a family is, how you live in a family, your roles and responsibility. They lived in an environment where they had to fend for themselves. And they took those attitudes back out into the community when they were kicked out. 85% of the men from Kinchela, the boys from Kinchela, ended up incarcerated. They have one of the highest death rates and drug and alcohol misuse rates of any demographic in the country. They've recently formed the Kinchela Aboriginal Corporation, Kinchela Boys Aboriginal Corporation, to access funding to get counselling and support. A lot of those men came to me as clients, well, not a lot, a large number, I'll rephrase it, a large number of them came to Link-Up to be reconnected with their family, and a large number of them wanted to have me as their counsellor because they'd heard about this boy, and they call me a boy, I really feel honoured that they do, this boy who'd went through Sunnylands Boys Home, was in and out of jail, alcoholic, drug addict, abuser of people, abuser of women, violent, and had turned his life around to be able to find a place in his being, but also within his community, where he could go on and help other men to find some level of peace. So a lot of them asked for me to be their counsellor, and I was really honoured. So I did, I supported them. And one of the things I wanted to talk to them about was what's happening for you right at the very bottom of your heart. What's going on for you in regards to your feelings? What do you feel inside of here? And for most of them, the feeling was fear. They were so afraid of everything. Afraid of the society that they live in, afraid to be judged, afraid to apply for a job, afraid, it was all driven by fear. And the only way most of them could express that fear was through anger. And that anger came out in every part of their lives. And for those guys who'd ended up in jail, and I would go into Long Bay and counsel clients, and I'd say to them, how do you feel about being in here? And they would say, I don't feel anything. And then after further exploration, most of these men, and they're in their 60s, they would say, I feel scared. But it wasn't about being scared for being in jail. They were scared as to what their family was going through by them being removed. But when they went get out and go to their families, quite often they didn't know how to interact and engage with their family because there was nobody that ever taught them how to be fathers, how to be a member of your community, how to be a member of society, how to just be a person walking down the street and want to go and have a cup of coffee at a cafe. Everything that we take for granted. I found time and time again Aboriginal men who had this difficulty. The work that I do now for the Education Centre Against Violence, Eric and I developed a workshop, a program called the Strong Aboriginal Men Program, and it came about as a result of the issue being identified that there were lots and lots of things happening to support women around violence in their community and sexual assault, child sexual assault, but there was not enough being done for men. And so ECAV decided that they would invite myself and Eric to come together, and another man by the name of Tony Pearce. We got together and we started the conversation about how are we going to work with Aboriginal men around the issue of domestic violence, family violence and child protection within their communities. And we developed the SAM program, and it's a tool that we use to get men talking. And one of the very first things that we do with the men, we sit them in a circle and we invite them to tell us a little bit about themselves. We also invite them to pass if they're at that point in time they can't say anything or they have nothing to say. We found that with the men that come to these workshops, once we provide a safe environment where they can talk and they see other men talking, what happens is they start talking and they start revealing their stories. It's an opportunity for them to be able to have a voice. We create a safe environment with some group agreements. They're not rules, they're agreements that they agree on. They make the agreements. They provide the environment where they can talk about what's going on for them in their lives around domestic violence, around child protection, around sexual assault, child sexual assault. And we work with them. But we don't go in there to try to save them and help them. We actually encourage them to start talking with each other. Because we identify that one of the things that is missing within our Aboriginal communities, and I don't doubt within the greater community as well, is that if we don't have other men who we can go and talk to about the issues in our lives, we're left to resolve them in our own minds. And I don't know about the rest of the men out there, but being in my mind is a really dangerous place. Yeah? I should not be left alone in my own thoughts. When I have other men to talk to about stuff, and when the other Aboriginal men have other men to talk to about what's happening in their lives, how they feel, not what's going on in the physical world, how they feel, what are their feelings and what's going on for them, what we find is they're having realisations. They're having realisations about how what they're doing not only impacts on them as a man, but impacts on their partner and affects the children and impacts on the children. And we often talk about how the men hand down their behaviours to their children just by behaving. That living in that close confines of the Aboriginal community, and we know about the housing issues for Aboriginal families, the lack of it, and so we have families that, 2 families living in a domicile, or 3 families living in a domicile or close to each other, but then we also have the scenario where Aboriginal people are plopped down into a particular area and that's where they live. We don't integrate them throughout the whole of the community. We plop them all there, keep them all there, and the children grow up in that environment seeing what's going on for the adults in that environment, and that's normalised behaviour. So the drug and the alcohol misuse, the domestic violence, the family violence, the sexual assaults, the cousin loving, which is happening prevalently throughout our Aboriginal communities, where the breakdown of roles and responsibility is happening all the time. The children grow up in that, and the young boys and the young men grow up in that, and that becomes the normal. So what I wanted to talk about in this, and what I hopefully have covered here, is that from my story you're able to see that for Aboriginal people, and my story is not abnormal for an Aboriginal man, it is not unique. I have sat down and listened to dozens of Aboriginal men tell my story. What I wanted to do was for you to see the impacts of stolen generation and colonisation on Aboriginal people. The loss of roles and responsibilities for the Aboriginal men within our community, within our families, and within ourselves. But I also wanted to highlight that the community as a whole, Australia as a whole, we have these issues because of how we perceive what men should be, what we think men should be like, how men should behave. And they're distorted. They're not very good. When we look at the news and we see things happening in regards to Friday nights or Saturday nights in the streets where violence is acted out all the time. We're a country where they're building drunk tanks for people just to go and sit in to sober up. It's just ridiculous. The cost to us as a society is immense. And it's because those young men think that in order to be a man, you've got to drink 10 gallons of grog and you've got to beat somebody up. I know for me personally, my changes in my life to come to the realisation where I said, I don't want to hurt anybody. But first and foremost, I don't want to hurt me. And if I don't hurt me today, what I've done is I've honoured myself, I've respected myself, and I'd be damned if I'm going to hurt somebody else. I just won't do it. Because I'm worth that kind of honour, I'm worth that kind of love, I'm worth that kind of respect, I'm worth more than that. I'm worthy of having a friend like Eric Hudson. I'm worthy of sitting here on a panel in front of a whole lot of beautiful people who are working for the same goal. I'm worthy of that. That's an honour. That's a respect for me. I've been viewed a second time around. In 2000, people took off their glasses, they put them back on and they took another look at me. And I now have a responsibility to maintain that respect. And that's what I endeavour to do on a daily basis by working with Aboriginal men and with non-Aboriginal men, when required, to talk about how we can go about changing ourselves so as that our women and our children have a safer place to be. And whether it's to be in our lives or whether it's to be in our community. I think that is the absolute most important gift that we as any man can give to our children, that we provide a safe environment. And you know what? It doesn't take money to give. It doesn't take money to do. What it takes is 2 men to sit down together and start having a conversation. And I'm really honoured to be here tonight, today, and to share my story, but also to talk about the issue of violence or men who are violent in our communities. And I would hope that, you know, I know that Eric and I have made a change in some men's lives, and the result of that change that we've made in those men's lives means that there's children out there who are going to have a better life than I had when I grew up, and that's the best gift that I could ever possibly want to give. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mum.